16 years ago, Renata Alvarez was a night shift trauma nurse who found a frightened, half-frozen boy sleeping behind her hospital's loading dock and made the decision that would change both their lives forever. She gave him a bed, a last name, and a promise that no one would ever leave him behind again. 16 years later, that same woman stood in a boardroom being told she was about to lose the company her late husband had built from nothing. But when the doors finally opened, the boy from that freezing parking lot walked in wearing a suit and carrying the one document that could save everything. If you love stories about quiet kindness coming back around at exactly the right moment, subscribe now, because this one is going to stay with you. The wind off Lake Superior that November night was the kind that found its way through every seam in a coat, no matter how good the coat was. Duluth had already gotten its first real snow of the season, and the emergency room parking lot was a sheet of gray slush under the sodium lights. Renata Alvarez was 34 years old then, coming off a 14-hour shift in the trauma bay, her scrubs smelling faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee, her feet aching in a way that had become so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. She was 2 years a widow. Her husband, Marco, had died in an accident at the small tool and die shop he'd inherited from his father, a cramped machine floor on the edge of the old steel district that made precision parts for anyone who'd pay on time. Renata had kept the shop running out of stubbornness more than anything else, because closing it felt like one more funeral she wasn't ready to hold. She was walking to her car that night, keys already in her hand, when she heard it. Not crying exactly. More like breathing that was trying very hard not to become crying. She followed the sound behind the loading dock, past the stacked oxygen cylinders, and found a boy folded into the space between a dumpster and the wall, knees to his chest, a garbage bag serving as the only thing between him and the cold concrete. He was maybe 12, underfed in the specific way that told Renata, professionally, that it had been going on for a while. His sneakers had duct tape wrapped around the toes. When he saw her, he didn't run, and that told her something too, that running had stopped being useful to him a long time ago. She didn't reach for him. She'd worked enough overnight shifts to know that reaching for a scared kid was the fastest way to make him bolt. Instead, she crouched down at a distance, the way she would with an animal that had been kicked one too many times, and asked his name in the low, unhurried voice she used on frightened patients. "Ellis," he said after a long pause. Nothing else. She went back inside and got him a blanket and a cup of the bad hospital hot chocolate from the vending machine, and she sat with him on an overturned milk crate while security called it in. And while they waited for someone from child services, Ellis asked her the only question that mattered. He asked if she was going to leave once the van showed up. Renata had heard that question phrased 100 different ways from 100 different scared people in a hospital bed, and she recognized it instantly for what it was. He wasn't asking about tonight. He was asking if anyone, anywhere, intended to keep him. She told him the truth, which was that she didn't know yet, but that she wasn't going anywhere until she did. What followed was 8 months of paperwork, home inspections, a caseworker named Delphine Cube who became, in her own quiet way, one of the fiercest advocates Renata ever met, and a family court judge who asked Renata exactly one hard question: whether she understood that raising a boy with Ellis's history alone, on a nurse's salary, running a machine shop that barely broke even, was going to be difficult in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Renata had answered that difficult was not the same as impossible, and that she had buried a husband and kept his company alive with her own 2 hands, so she was fairly well acquainted with things that were supposed to be impossible. The adoption was finalized on a gray Tuesday in a courthouse annex that smelled like old carpet and copier toner. There was no ceremony to it. Renata knelt down, put a small brass key into Ellis's palm, the spare to the house on 9th Street, and closed his fingers around it. "In this house," she told him, "nobody sleeps behind a dumpster. Not ever again." He held onto that key so hard his knuckles went white, and he held on to that sentence for the next 16 years. Time did the thing it always does, which is move faster than anyone standing inside it can quite believe. Renata kept working nights at the hospital and kept the shop, Alvarez Precision, limping along during the day, and in the evenings, after Ellis had done his homework at the kitchen table under a lamp with a cracked shade, she'd walk the machine floor with him trailing behind her, and she started noticing that he noticed things. He noticed that half the shop's late deliveries came down to one bad forklift and a scheduling system written on a whiteboard. He noticed that Marco's old customer contracts were priced so far below the actual cost of materials that the shop was essentially paying people to take its work. He noticed, at 14, sitting at that same kitchen table, that nobody in the building had ever renegotiated a single supplier agreement since his mother's late husband had signed them a decade earlier. Renata didn't have an engineering degree or an MBA. What she had was 20 years of watching bodies fail under stress in an ER and an instinct for finding the point where a system was about to break before it broke. She started applying that instinct to the shop, machine by machine, contract by contract, and Ellis, quiet, watchful, absurdly good at numbers for a kid who'd once owned nothing but a garbage bag, became her sounding board. By the time Ellis was 16, Alvarez Precision had gone from 11 late-paying accounts to a contract with a regional automotive supplier that actually turned a profit. By the time he was 18 and heading off to college on a combination of loans and a scholarship Renata had spent an entire year helping him apply for, the shop had grown into Alvarez Precision Manufacturing, with 2 buildings and 90 employees. Ellis studied economics first, then pivoted, in his junior year, into corporate and trust law, a decision he explained to Renata over a phone call by saying that he'd spent his whole childhood watching people lose things they'd built because they didn't understand the fine print, and he intended to be the kind of person who understood the fine print for a living. Renata told him, the way she'd told him 100 things over the years, straightforward and without decoration. Never sign anything you haven't read to the very last word. And never let a lawyer's silence be the reason a good person loses everything. He carried that sentence into every classroom, every internship, every bar exam study session for the next 6 years. It became, in its own way, the whole architecture of the man he grew into. Over 16 years, Alvarez Precision Manufacturing became something neither Renata nor Marco could have imagined from that cramped machine floor. It supplied precision components to 3 major automotive lines and 2 aerospace subcontractors. It employed 412 people across 2 states. Independent appraisers, when the moment eventually came that required an appraisal, valued the company at just under $780 million. And the larger it grew, the more strangers Renata was forced to let sit at her boardroom table. That, though she didn't understand it yet, was exactly where the danger started. By the time this story reaches its present, Renata Alvarez was no longer a night shift nurse patching a dying machine shop together with borrowed money and stubbornness. She was the founder and majority shareholder of one of the most reliable precision manufacturers in the upper Midwest. And yet she still drove the same 14-year-old truck to the plant every morning. Still ate her lunch standing at the break room counter with the machinist instead of in the private dining room the board had built for her and never used, and still wore her late husband's old canvas work jacket over her blazer on cold mornings because it was warm and because it was his. To the people on her factory floor, that simplicity made her someone worth walking through a wall for. To her board of directors, it increasingly made her look like a liability. A woman who ran a 9-figure company like it was still a corner shop, sentimental, unsophisticated, and, in the private language some of them used when they thought no one else could hear, soft. Diane Cortland, the chair of the board, had built her entire career on the conviction that sentiment had no place anywhere near a balance sheet. She was polished in the specific way that came from decades of quiet lunches and committee memos, and she had decided, long before this story's climax, that a woman who ate lunch standing up at a break room counter was not fit to steer a company approaching $1 billion valuation. Cortland found an ally in Marcus Whitfield, the managing partner of a private equity firm called Whitfield Sable Capital, a man who wore his ambition the way other men wore cologne, applied heavily, and noticed by everyone in the room before he said a word. Together, they built a plan to force Renata to surrender her controlling shares at a fraction of what they were worth, then fold the whole company into Whitfield Sable's portfolio. Their plan was patient, and it was precise, and it hinged on one piece of leverage they believed was unbreakable. 16 years earlier, when Ellis was still a teenager and the company was still small enough to run informally, Renata had set aside a block of founding shares into something called the Alvarez Family Protective Trust, naming Ellis, the boy with no blood relation to her at all, as its eventual guardian. Cortland and Whitfield built their entire legal assault around that single trust. They filed a shareholder complaint accusing Renata of diverting company equity to enrich a family member with no legitimate stake in the business, arguing that the trust was, at best, a serious breach of fiduciary duty and, at worst, outright fraud dressed up as sentiment. Their goal was to convince a judge to freeze Renata's voting authority long enough to force an emergency sale straight into Whitfield Sable's hands, at a valuation 40% below what independent appraisers had already established. It was elegant, and it was cruel, and it was built specifically to make the single kindest decision of Renata's life look, on paper, like the mechanism of a crime. What blindsided Renata most wasn't the accusation itself. It was how thoroughly they'd twisted the story of a frightened boy behind a dumpster into a weapon. The complaint referred to Ellis not by name, but by his relationship to the case, the unrelated minor beneficiary, as though the years she'd spent teaching him to read a contract had been nothing but the early stages of a scheme. The story leaked to a regional business paper within a week, and the framing was brutal. A beloved local founder accused of quietly funneling company equity to a boy she'd taken in off the street, now facing scrutiny that could cost hundreds of employees their jobs. Renata's plant manager, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis Boone, who'd worked the floor since Marco's time, wanted to fight back publicly, immediately, loudly. Renata put a hand on his arm and told him, with the same steadiness she'd once used on a frightened boy behind a hospital, that the truth had its own current, and that if she didn't panic, it would eventually surface on its own. But what actually kept her up at night wasn't the threat to the company. She'd been poor before. She knew, in a way most people in that boardroom never would, that she could survive being poor again. What cut her was watching them take the single most human thing she'd ever done and describe it, in cold legal language, as evidence of greed. On the evening before everything came to a head, a courier delivered a summons to the house on 9th Street, and the timeline it laid out was brutal in its simplicity. A hearing in 72 hours would decide the fate of everything she and Marco and Ellis had built. When the crisis broke, everyone who cared about Renata went looking for Ellis. He was 30 years old by then, a trust and corporate fraud attorney at a mid-sized firm in Chicago, exactly the kind of specialist the case desperately needed. By any reasonable measure, he was the single most qualified person alive to defend her. And at the precise hour Renata needed him most, Ellis didn't answer his phone. His office said only that he was traveling. His apartment sat dark for 2 nights running. The silence stretched long enough that it started to breed its own kind of doubt. Had Ellis chosen his career over the woman who raised him? Had Whitfield's money reached him first? Was there some secret of his own buried under that silence? Diane Cortland fed that absence to the press with practiced, sorrowful precision, telling a reporter that even Renata Alvarez's own adopted son wouldn't stand up to defend her, and that this, surely, told the public something. Marcus Whitfield, in a brief interview delivered from the lobby of his firm's downtown offices, remarked that a company could never be run on sentiment, and that sentiment had finally caught up with a woman who should have known better. Renata didn't blame Ellis. Late one night in the small study off her kitchen, she took down an old photograph from the bookshelf, a faded picture of a boy in a coat 2 sizes too big, standing on the steps of the 9th Street house on the day the adoption was finalized, and held it for a long time. Then she told Curtis Boone, who'd stayed late with her going over the plants numbers for the 3rd time that week, that Ellis owed her nothing. She hadn't taken him in expecting repayment. There had never been any arithmetic to it at all. That refusal to treat love as a debt made her larger in that dark week, not smaller. What no one in Duluth knew was that Ellis hadn't vanished out of fear or betrayal. He was 400 miles away, in the archive room of a small law office in downtown Chicago that had once handled the trust's original paperwork, searching for a single sealed document that would change the entire shape of the accusation against his mother. Late on the second night, buried under filing boxes that hadn't been opened in over a decade, he found it. An archival folder, its edges soft with age, and across the front, in Renata's own handwriting, a line he read 3 times before he let himself trust it. It read, "For Ellis. Open it when the court finally asks who the trust was really protecting." He sat down on the cold floor of that archive room, the folder in his lap, and for the first time in years, the frightened boy behind the dumpster and the sharp young attorney became, fully, the same person again. The hearing convened in a gray federal commercial courtroom on a Thursday morning, the air thick with the specific, airless pressure of a room where a lot of money is about to change hands. Renata sat at the defense table beside a corporate attorney who had inherited a case far bigger and stranger than anything in his usual practice. Across the aisle, Marcus Whitfield's legal team was led by a sharp-elbowed litigator named Corbin Hale, a man whose entire reputation was built on strangling opponents with the very contracts they'd signed. Judge Patricia Alvarado, no relation, a coincidence the local paper had already noted twice, presided with the flat, unimpressed patience of someone who had thrown wealthier men than Whitfield out of her courtroom before lunch. She asked both sides to state their positions plainly. Corbin Hale opened with the confidence of a man holding a winning hand. He put the trust documents on the screen, then the wire transfers, then Renata's signature, enlarged until it filled the wall. He painted the picture for the court, a sentimental single mother, blinded by affection for a boy with no blood tie to her at all, quietly funneling company equity into his name. It was a devastating performance, not because it attacked Renata's finances, but because it took the single kindest act of her life and reforged it, piece by piece, into a weapon aimed directly at her. When Hale turned and asked Renata, in front of the packed gallery, whether she had taken in a homeless child named Ellis Marsh, she answered simply that she had. When he asked whether she had established a trust in his name, she answered again that she had. A murmur went through the room, and within minutes the story was already moving across every regional business wire. Founder admits diverting equity to adopted son. Diane Cortland allowed herself a small, satisfied smile from the second row. Renata's borrowed attorney rose to argue that the trust had a lawful purpose, but without the original documents in hand, his argument sounded thin, defensive, exactly the way a losing argument sounds. The momentum in the room tilted hard against the defense, and the machinery of the court began, slowly and steadily, to move toward freezing Renata's voting rights. Judge Alvarado asked, at last, whether the defense had any further witnesses or evidence. Renata's attorney fell silent. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom stayed shut. And then, in the exact second the judge lifted her pen to sign a preliminary order, those doors opened. A man in a dark, unremarkable suit walked in carrying a leather portfolio, and he didn't hurry, and he didn't apologize for the interruption. He walked straight to the clerk's table with the flat, rehearsed calm of someone who had pictured this exact moment 100 times, and he said, in a clear, even voice, "Ellis Marsh, appearing for the defense. I move to submit emergency evidence." The room went silent. Renata turned in her chair, and for one suspended second, she didn't see an attorney at all. She saw a 12-year-old boy behind a dumpster, asking if she was going to leave. But she didn't let it show, and neither did he. 16 years of the exact patience she'd taught him had already locked itself in a place behind his face. Corbin Hale objected immediately, arguing that Ellis Marsh, as Renata's adopted son, carried an obvious conflict of interest. Ellis answered without a flicker of heat. Since the plaintiffs had made his identity and his adoption the entire centerpiece of their accusation, he had every right to testify to the truth of the trust and to argue its terms. The logic was airtight, and it turned Hale's own strategy directly against him. Judge Alvarado, after a long look at both attorneys, allowed Ellis to proceed. He opened the leather portfolio and produced the original Alvarez Family Protective Trust, the sealed document his mother had drafted years before the company had grown into anything worth fighting over. He walked the judge through its actual language, and that language proved the exact opposite of what the plaintiffs had claimed. Renata hadn't diverted company assets to enrich her son. She had placed a protective block of founding shares into a trust specifically designed to prevent the board from ever selling the company against the principles it had been built on. The fund wasn't a theft. It was a wall. That was the first reversal, and it landed hard. Ellis wasn't the secret beneficiary of stolen equity. He was the named guardian of a safeguard his mother had built years before anyone thought to attack her. The one mechanism standing between Alvarez's precision and exactly the kind of hostile maneuver now unfolding in that room. Ellis turned and looked directly at Diane Cortland. "The question was never what my mother gave me," he said. "The question is who's been trying to sell something that was never theirs to sell." He moved to his second piece of evidence, a handwritten letter Renata had attached to the original trust filing on the day the adoption was finalized. Hale scoffed that a sentimental family note carried no legal weight. Ellis was ready for exactly that. He showed that the letter hadn't simply been kept as a keepsake. It had been formally incorporated by reference into the trust document itself, which meant it carried the full force of law. He read from it, and the courtroom went still in a different way. In the letter, Renata had written that she'd lost a husband once and wouldn't stand by while anyone was left behind for lacking money or a name. She'd written that the trust wasn't meant to make Ellis wealthy. It was meant to protect the company from exactly the kind of people who would one day try to turn it into a machine for their own profit. And buried in the final paragraph was a clause that seemed to reach forward across 16 years and land directly in that room. If the board ever weaponized Ellis's past against the family, that act itself would trigger the trust's full protective authority. Hale objected that any such clause had long since expired. Ellis produced the annual renewal filings, submitted precisely on schedule every single year by the company's longtime corporate secretary, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Nair, who was called to the stand and confirmed, under oath, that Cortland had deliberately buried those renewal filings from the rest of the board, so that when the lawsuit arrived, no director would remember the trust had been filed openly, year after year, in plain sight. Across the aisle, Marcus Whitfield's composure cracked at the edges, because he understood, faster than anyone else in the room, that if this clause was recognized as valid, the entire acquisition collapsed into dust. Ellis stopped defending and started attacking. He entered into evidence a chain of internal messages between Cortland and Whitfield, exchanged with the careless confidence of people who never expected anyone to read them aloud in open court. Cortland had agreed to apply legal pressure specifically to depress the company's price before Whitfield Sable made its formal offer. In their messages, they'd referred to Renata as the nurse with a charity case, and to Ellis himself as the emotional lever. Hale argued the messages had been altered. Ellis was ready for that too, entering the metadata, the digital signatures, and a certified forensic analysis that confirmed every line. Then came the payment records, A transfer routed from a shell entity controlled by Whitfield Sable into a personal consulting account belonging to Diane Courtland, dated the exact same day she'd filed the original complaint. Judge Alvarado turned to Courtland and demanded, flatly, that she explain the payment. For the first time in the entire hearing, Courtland had no answer that wouldn't condemn her. The final blow came when Ellis produced the minutes of a closed-door meeting in which Courtland had promised Whitfield that if Renata's voting rights could be frozen, the board would approve a sale of 51% of the company at a price nearly 40% below its true value, enough to gut every shareholder and every one of the 412 families who depended on that company for a paycheck. Judge Alvarado ordered an immediate halt to any transaction involving Whitfield Sable Capital pending full review. Whitfield, cornered, made one last attempt to salvage the case by directing his attorney to attack Ellis's own credibility, forcing him to answer questions about his childhood on the record, the homelessness, the years without birth parents, the tuition Renata had paid. The purpose was transparent. Paint him as a man so buried in gratitude he couldn't possibly be objective. Ellis didn't flinch. He answered every question honestly and without shame. Yes, Renata had given him a home, a name, an education. He would never pretend otherwise. But then he turned the confession into his sharpest argument. Because she'd given him those things, he understood, better than anyone else in that room, the difference between a debt and a promise. A debt is something you repay to be free of it. A promise is something you keep because of who you've decided to be. He hadn't come into that courtroom to repay a debt with emotion. He'd come because the documents proved the truth, and the truth didn't need gratitude to make it real. Then he revealed the last card. Whitfield Sable, through an intermediary, had approached Ellis before the hearing and offered him a partnership at a major New York firm on one condition: that he simply failed to show up. Ellis had recorded the entire conversation, lawfully, under the recording statutes of the state where it took place, because his mother had taught him to protect the truth before he ever tried to use it. The recording played for the courtroom. A voice said, plainly, "We don't need you to betray your mother. We just need you to stay quiet." Those words did more damage than any spreadsheet, because they exposed the actual shape of the plan. They'd never needed Ellis's betrayal. They'd only needed his silence. And now that silence had been broken open in front of the entire court, Judge Alvarado entered the recording into the record and issued a formal warning regarding witness interference. The case tilted, fully and finally, onto its new axis. With the fraud laid bare, Ellis read the trust's final clause into the record. If the founder were ever attacked through a fabricated financial accusation tied to her family, and that accusation was proven to have been manufactured to force a hostile sale, then temporary voting authority would pass to the trust's named protector, a role that had belonged, since a quiet afternoon 16 years earlier, to Ellis Marsh. The meaning swept through the room. In using Ellis as the instrument to destroy Renata, Courtland and Whitfield had unknowingly triggered the very safeguard that now protected her. The weapon they'd built out of his past had turned in their hands and become the shield that saved everything. Judge Alvarado reviewed the signatures, confirmed the filing dates, and issued an emergency ruling. Renata's authority would not be frozen. The sale was suspended immediately. Diane Courtland was removed from every decision touching the company, pending a full fraud investigation. And Ellis Marsh was formally recognized as protector of the founding voting authority for the duration of that investigation. Whitfield rose to leave. Judge Alvarado ordered him to remain, informing him coldly that he might yet be implicated in the manipulation of evidence and the interference with a witness. Renata bowed her head, not in defeat, but because she understood that her company had just been saved by the very boy who had once asked her, from behind a dumpster on a freezing November night, whether she was ever coming back. After the courtroom emptied, Renata and Ellis found each other in the corridor outside, and there was no performance to the moment, because they had both been through far too much for theater. Renata looked at him for a long time before she spoke. "I thought you'd gone," she said. "I learned it from you," Ellis answered. "When someone builds a trap in front of the door, you find the way in from the back." His answer told her everything, that she hadn't only raised him. She'd shaped the actual architecture of how his mind worked. Calm, practical, and relentless in pursuit of the truth all the way to the bottom. Renata apologized for letting his past get dragged into open court, for the way strangers had picked over the hardest years of his life like line items on a ledger. Ellis told her it wasn't her fault, that people like Cortland and Whitfield always assumed a person's hard beginnings were something that could be used to shame them, when in fact they were the very thing that had taught him, better than any of his opponents, what a roof, a key, and a kept promise were actually worth. Curtis Boone appeared at the end of the hallway and pulled Ellis into a rough, wordless hug, and for a moment the three of them just stood there, whole, without needing to say anything else. Renata asked him, eventually, why he hadn't told her the plan before he vanished, why he'd let her sit through those long, silent days believing she might be facing this alone. "If you'd known," Ellis said, "you'd have spent every ounce of your strength trying to protect me instead, and you might have tipped them off before I found what I needed." He paused. "This time, I wanted to be the one doing the protecting." And there, in that plain hallway, the whole shape of the story finally settled into place. 16 years earlier, Renata had walked into Ellis's life in the exact moment he had no one left in the world. 16 years later, he had walked into a courtroom in the exact moment she was about to lose everything. "I didn't take you in so you'd save me one day," Renata said, her voice rough. "I know," Ellis answered, "but you taught me never to let families stand alone out in the cold." They stood together in that quiet a long time, a mother and a son bound by no blood at all, and by something that had proven, in the end, to be far stronger. In the weeks that followed, Alvarez Precision Manufacturing rebuilt its board from the ground up. Diane Cortland faced a formal fraud investigation for manipulating financial records and interfering with a witness, and the polished reputation she'd spent 2 decades constructing came apart in a matter of days. Marcus Whitfield lost the acquisition and became the subject of a financial inquiry that would follow him for years. Corbin Hale quietly withdrew from the case, abandoning his own clients in what was, in its own way, the single most honest thing he did through the entire ordeal. Renata returned to running the company, but never again alone. She'd learned, in the hardest possible way, what isolation could cost. She promoted Curtis Boone to oversee plant operations outright, gave the corporate secretary, Priya, direct oversight of the company's financial transparency so that no filing would ever again be buried in the dark, and asked Ellis to serve as permanent counsel to the family trust, not as a symbolic gesture, but because he had proven himself the one person willing to defend the company from anyone who tried to use a contract to break a promise. Ellis accepted on one condition, that he would answer to the trust's actual terms, and to the truth, and to nothing else. Renata gathered the entire company on the plant floor where she'd once worked double shifts trying to keep the lights on, and she told them, plainly, the short version of a story about a cold November night many years earlier. She didn't tell it to make herself look kind. She told it to remind every person standing there that Alvarez Precision had been built on one unbreakable rule. No one gets left behind for lacking money, or power, or a name that opens doors. Ellis stood beside her while she spoke, no longer the frightened boy from behind a dumpster, but the man who had used the full weight of the law to protect his mother, and, in doing so, the 412 families who depended on that company for their next paycheck. The story closes on an ordinary morning at the plant, sunlight cutting hard across the loading dock where a truck idled, waiting to be loaded. Renata watched the morning shift come in, watched the machines come alive one by one down the line, exactly the way they had for 16 years. Ellis came to stand beside her, and he pressed something small and cold into her palm. It was the old brass key, the very one she'd folded into his hand on the day the adoption was finalized, the one he'd carried in his pocket through every year since. "You gave me a key when I had nowhere to go," he said. "Today I'm only giving you back the key to everything you built." Renata turned the worn metal over once in her fingers, then slipped it into the pocket of the same canvas jacket she still wore on cold mornings. The jacket that had gone with her from the docks of a struggling machine shop to a federal courtroom and back again. The company was safe. The valuation was restored. But far more than that, the promise she'd made beneath a loading dock light on a freezing November night, that in her house, nobody would ever be left out in the cold, remained exactly as whole as the day she first made it.